The Miss Dashwoods had now been rather more than 2 months in town, and Marianne's impatience to be gone increased every day. Elinor was hardly less anxious than herself for their removal, and had already mentioned their wishes to their kind hostess, who resisted them with all the eloquence of her good will, when a plan was suggested which, though detaining them from home yet a few weeks longer, appeared to Elinor altogether much more eligible than any other. The Palmers were to remove to Cleveland about the end of March for the Easter holidays, and Mrs. Jennings, with both her friends, received a very warm invitation from Charlotte to go with them. It was enforced with so much real politeness by Mr. Palmer himself as induced her to accept it with pleasure. When she told Marianne what she had done, however, her first reply was not very auspicious. "Cleveland? No, I cannot go to Cleveland." "You forget," said Elinor gently. "It is not in the neighbourhood of—" "But it is in Somersetshire. I cannot get into Somersetshire. No, Elinor, you cannot expect me to go there." Elinor would not argue upon the propriety of overcoming such feelings. She only represented it as returning to that dear mother whom she so much wished to see. From Cleveland, which was within a few miles from Bristol, the distance to Barton was not beyond 1 day, and as there could be no occasion for their staying above a week at Cleveland, they might now be at home in a little more than 3 weeks' time. Mrs. Jennings pressed them earnestly to return with her again from Cleveland. Elinor was grateful for the attention, but it could not alter their design. "Ah, Colonel, I do not know what you and I shall do without the Miss Dashwoods," was Mrs. Jennings' address to Colonel Brandon when he first called on her after their leaving her was settled. On Elinor's moving to the window, he followed her to it with a look of particular meaning. "I have heard," said he, with great compassion, "of the injustice your friend Mr. Ferrars has suffered from his family. I understand that he intends to take orders. Will you be so good as to tell him that the living of Delaford, now just vacant, as I am informed by this day's post, is his, if he think it worth his acceptance?" Elinor's astonishment at this commission could hardly have been greater. The preferment, which only 2 days before she had considered as hopeless for Edward, was already provided to enable him to marry, and she, of all people in the world, was fixed to bestow it. She thanked him for it with all her heart, and promised to undertake the commission with pleasure, if it were really his wish to put off so agreeable an office to another. Edward, she believed, was still in town, and fortunately she had heard his address from Miss Steele. She could undertake, therefore, to inform him of it in the course of the day. How should she express herself in her note to Edward was now all her concern. She sat deliberating over her paper with her pen in her hand, till broken in on by the entrance of Edward himself. He had met Mrs. Jennings at the door in her way to the carriage as he came to leave his farewell card, and she, after apologizing for not returning herself, had obliged him to enter by saying that Miss Dashwood was above and wanted to speak with him on a very particular business. Elinor had just been congratulating herself that, however difficult it might be to express herself properly by letter, it was at least preferable to giving the information by word of mouth, when her visitor entered. Her astonishment and confusion were very great on his so sudden appearance. He was too much distressed, and they sat down together in a most promising state of embarrassment. "Mrs. Jennings told me," said he, "that you wished to speak with me, at least I understood her so, or I certainly should not have intruded on you in such a manner, though at the same time I should have been extremely sorry to leave London without seeing you and your sister." "You would not have gone, however," said Elinor, recovering herself, "without receiving our good wishes, even if we had not been able to give them in person. Mrs. Jennings was quite right in what she said. I am charged with a most agreeable office. Colonel Brandon, who was here only 10 minutes ago, has desired me to say that, understanding you mean to take orders, he has great pleasure in offering you the living of Delaford, now just vacant, and only wishes it were more valuable. Allow me to congratulate you on having so respectable and well-judging a friend, and to join in his wish that the living, it is about 200 a year, were much more considerable. Edward looked, all the astonishment which such unexpected information could not fail in exciting, but he said only these 2 words, "Colonel Brandon." "Yes," continued Elinor, "Colonel Brandon means it as a testimony of his concern for what has lately passed." When Mrs. Jennings came home, her mind was so occupied by the important secret in her possession that she reverted to it again as soon as Elinor appeared. "Well, my dear," she cried, "I sent you up the young man. You did not find him very unwilling to accept your proposal?" "No, ma'am, that was not very likely." "Well, and how soon will he be ready?" "I suppose 2 or 3 months will complete his ordination." 2 or 3 months!" cried Mrs. Jennings. "Can the Colonel wait 2 or 3 months? Lord bless me! Though one would be very glad to do a kindness by poor Mr. Ferrars, I do not think it is worth while to wait 2 or 3 months for him. Sure, somebody else must be found that would do as well. Somebody that is in orders already." "My dear ma'am," said Elinor, "what can you be thinking of? Why, Colonel Brandon's only object is to be of use to Mr. Ferrars." "Lord bless you, my dear! Sure, you do not mean to persuade me that the Colonel only marries you for the sake of giving 10 guineas to Mr. Ferrars?" The deception could not continue after this, and an explanation immediately took place, by which both gained considerable amusement for the moment, without any material loss of happiness to either. Edward, having carried his thanks to Colonel Brandon, proceeded with his happiness to Lucy, and such was the excess of it by the time he reached Bartlett's building that she was able to assure Mrs. Jennings, who called on her the next day with her congratulations, that she had never seen him in such spirits before in her life. It was now above a week since John Dashwood had called in Berkeley Street, and as since that time no notice had been taken by them of his wife's indisposition, beyond one verbal inquiry, Elinor began to feel it necessary to pay her a visit. Marianne, not contented with absolutely refusing to go herself, was very urgent to prevent her sister's going at all, and Mrs. Jennings so very much disliked Mrs. John Dashwood that she could not overcome her unwillingness to be in her company again. The consequence was that Elinor set out by herself to pay a visit. John Dashwood expressed great pleasure in greeting Elinor and, assuring her that Fanny would be very glad to see her, invited her to come in. They walked upstairs into the drawing-room. Nobody was there. "Fanny is in her room, I suppose," said he. "Why would not Marianne come?" Elinor made what excuse she could for her. "I am not sorry to see you alone," he replied, "for I have a good deal to say to you. This living of Colonel Brandon's, can it be true? Has he really given it to Edward?" "It is perfectly true." "Really? Well, this is very astonishing. No relationship, no connection between them? What could be the Colonel's motive?" "A very simple one. To be of use to Mr. Ferrars." "Well, well, whatever Colonel Brandon may be, Edward is a very lucky man. You will not mention the matter to Fanny. Mrs. Ferrars knows nothing about it at present, and I believe it will be best to keep it entirely concealed from her as long as may be." "But why should such precaution be used? She has done with her son. She has cast him off for ever." "Ah, Elinor," said John, "your reasoning is very good, but it is founded on ignorance of human nature. Mrs. Ferrars can never forget that Edward is her son." "You surprise me. I should think it must nearly have escaped her memory by this time." "You wrong her exceedingly. Mrs. Ferrars is one of the most affectionate mothers in the world." Elinor was silent, and John was also for a short time silent. His reflections ended thus. "Of one thing, my dear sister," taking her hand, "I may assure you. Indeed, I have it from the best authority, that in short, whatever objections there might be against a certain connection, you understand me, it would have been far preferable to her. It would not have given her half the vexation that this does." Eleanor had heard enough. If not to gratify her vanity and raise her self-importance, to agitate her nerves and fill her mind, and she was therefore glad to be spared from the necessity of saying much in reply herself, by the entrance of Mr. Robert Ferrars. After a few moments' chat, John Dashwood, recollecting that Fanny was yet uninformed of her sister's being there, quitted the room in quest of her, and Eleanor was left to improve her acquaintance with Robert. They had scarcely been 2 minutes by themselves before he began to speak of Edward, for he too had heard of the living, and was very inquisitive on the subject. Eleanor repeated the particulars of it as she had given them to John, and their effect on Robert, though very different, was not less striking than it had been on him. He laughed most immoderately. The idea of Edward's being a clergyman and living in a small parsonage house diverted him beyond measure. Eleanor could not restrain her eyes from being fixed on him with a look that spoke all the contempt it excited. It was a look, however, very well bestowed, for it relieved her own feelings and gave no intelligence to him. He was recalled from wit to wisdom, not by any reproof of hers, but by his own sensibility.
"We may treat it as a joke," said he, "but upon my soul, it is a most serious business. Poor Edward! He is ruined forever."
The entrance of Mrs. John Dashwood put an end to the subject. Eleanor could see an attempt at cordiality in her behaviour to herself. She even proceeded so far as to be concerned to find that Eleanor and her sister were so soon to leave town, as she had hoped to see more of them. Very early in April, and tolerably early in the day, the two parties from Hanover Square and Berkeley Street set out from their respective homes to meet, by appointment, on the road. They were to be more than 2 days on their journey, and Mr. Palmer, travelling more expeditiously with Colonel Brandon, was to join them at Cleveland soon after their arrival. Eleanor looked forward with hope to what a few months of tranquillity at Barton might do towards restoring Marianne's peace of mind and confirming her own. Their journey was safely performed. The 2nd day brought them into the county of Somerset, and in the forenoon of the 3rd they drove up to Cleveland. Cleveland was a spacious, modern-built house, situated on a sloping lawn. It had no park, but the pleasure grounds were tolerably extensive. Marianne entered the house with a heart swelling with emotion, from the consciousness of being only 80 miles from Barton, and not 30 from Combe Magna. And before she had been 5 minutes within its walls, she quitted it again, stealing away through the winding shrubberies to gain a distant eminence, where, from its Grecian temple, her eye, wandering over a wide tract of country to the south-east, could fondly rest on the farthest ridge of hills in the horizon, and fancy that from their summits Combe Magna might be seen. Nothing was wanting on Mrs. Palmer's side that constant and friendly good humour could do to make them feel themselves welcome. The openness and heartiness of her manner more than atoned for that want of elegance which made her often deficient in the forms of politeness. The two gentlemen arrived the next day to a very late dinner, affording a pleasant enlargement of the party, and a very welcome variety to their conversation, which a long morning of rain had reduced very low. 2 delightful twilight walks on the 3rd and 4th evenings of their being there, not merely on the dry gravel of the shrubbery, but where the grass was the longest and wettest, had, assisted by the imprudence of sitting in her wet shoes and stockings, given Marianne a cold. Though heavy and feverish, with a pain in her limbs, a cough, and a sore throat, a good night's rest was to cure her entirely, and it was with difficulty that Eleanor prevailed on her, when she went to bed, to try 1 or 2 of the simplest of remedies. Marianne got up the next morning at her usual time. To every inquiry replied that she was better. But a day spent in sitting shivering over the fire did not speak much in her favour of amendment, and when at last she went to bed, more and more indisposed, Colonel Brandon trusted, like Marianne, to the certainty and efficacy to sleep, and felt no real alarm. A very restless and feverish night, however, disappointed the expectation of both, and when Marianne, after persisting in rising, confessed herself unable to sit up, and returned voluntarily to her bed, Eleanor was very ready to adopt Mrs. Jennings' advice of sending for the Palmers' apothecary. He came, examined his patient, and though encouraging Miss Dashwood to expect that a very few days would restore her sister to health, yet by allowing the word infection to pass his lips, gave instant alarm to Mrs. Palmer on her baby's account. Mrs. Jennings urged the necessity of her immediate removal with her infant, and within an hour she set off with her little boy and his nurse for the house of a near relation of Mr. Palmer's. Mrs. Jennings, however, with a kindness of heart which made Eleanor really love her, declared her resolution of not stirring from Cleveland as long as Marianne remained ill. Poor Marianne, languid and low from the nature of her malady, and feeling herself universally ill, could no longer hope that tomorrow would find her recovered, the day they were to have begun their journey home. The next day she certainly was not better. Their party was now farther reduced, for Mr. Palmer was persuaded to perform his promise of following his wife, and while preparing to go, Colonel Brandon himself, with a much greater exertion, began to talk of going likewise. Here, however, the kindness of Mrs. Jennings interposed most acceptably, telling him at once that his stay at Cleveland was necessary. Marianne was of course kept in ignorance of all these arrangements. 2 days passed away from the time of Mr. Palmer's departure, and her situation continued, with little variation, the same. Mr. Harris, who attended her every day, still talked boldly of a speedy recovery, and Miss Dashwood was equally sanguine. But the expectation of the others was by no means so cheerful. Mrs. Jennings had determined very early in the seizure that Marianne would never get over it, and Colonel Brandon was not in a state of mind to resist their influence, and he could not expel from his mind the persuasion that he should see Marianne no more. On the morning of the 3rd day, however, the gloomy anticipations of both were almost done away, for when Mr. Harris arrived, he declared his patient materially better. But the day did not close so auspiciously as it began. Towards the evening, Marianne became ill again, growing more heavy, restless, and uncomfortable than before. Her sister, however, still sanguine, saw her with satisfaction sink at last into slumber. Mrs. Jennings, knowing nothing of any change in the patient, went unusually early to bed, and Eleanor remained alone with Marianne. The repose of the latter became more and more disturbed. Marianne, suddenly awakened by some accidental noise in the house, started hastily up, and with feverish wildness cried out, Is Mamma coming?" "Not yet," replied the other, concealing her terror. "But she will be here. It is a great way, you know, from hence to Barton." "But she must not go round by London," cried Marianne in the same hurried manner. I shall never see her if she goes by London." Eleanor perceived with alarm that she was not quite herself, and while attempting to soothe her, eagerly felt her pulse. It was lower and quicker than ever. Her alarm increased so rapidly as to determine her on sending instantly for Mr. Harris, and dispatching a messenger to Barton for her mother. To consult with Colonel Brandon on the best means of effecting the latter was a thought which immediately followed the resolution of its performance. It was no time for hesitation. He offered himself as the messenger who should fetch Mrs. Dashwood. Eleanor thanked him with brief though fervent gratitude, and while he went to hurry off his servant with a message to Mr. Harris and an order for post-horses directly, she wrote a few lines to her mother. The horses arrived even before they were expected, and Colonel Brandon, only pressing her hand with a look of solemnity and a few words spoken too low to reach her ear, hurried into the carriage. It was then about 12 o'clock, and she returned to her sister's apartment to wait for the arrival of the apothecary, and to watch by her for the rest of the night. It was a night of almost equal suffering to both. Hour after hour passed away in sleepless pain and delirium on Marianne's side, and in the most cruel anxiety on Eleanor's, before Mr. Harris appeared. His opinion, however, though acknowledging a very unexpected and unpleasant alteration in his patient, would not allow the danger to be material, and talked of the relief which a fresh mode of treatment must procure. He promised to call again in the course of 3 or 4 hours. With strong concern did Mrs. Jennings hear in the morning of what had passed. Her former apprehensions now left her no doubt of the event, and though trying to speak comfort to Eleanor, her conviction of her sister's danger would not allow her to offer the comfort of hope. Her heart was really grieved. Mr. Harris was punctual in his second visit, but he came to be disappointed. His medicines had failed, the fever was unabated, and Marianne remained in a heavy stupor. But he had still something more to try, of whose success he was almost as confident as the last, and his visit concluded with encouraging assurances. About noon, Eleanor began to fancy, to hope, she could perceive a slight amendment in her sister's pulse. She waited, watched, and examined it again and again, and at last ventured to communicate her hopes. Half an hour passed away, and the favourable symptom yet blessed her. Marianne was in every respect materially better, and Mrs. Jennings admitted with unfeigned joy the probability of an entire recovery. Eleanor continued by the side of her sister with a little intermission the whole afternoon. The time was now drawing on when Colonel Brandon might be expected back. At 7 o'clock, leaving Marianne sweetly asleep, she joined Mrs. Jennings in the drawing-room to tea. The wind roared around the house, and the rain beat against the windows, but Eleanor, all happiness within, regarded it not. Marianne slept through every blast, and the travellers, they had a rich reward in store for every present inconvenience. The clock struck 8. Eleanor heard a carriage driving up to the house, and in spite of the almost impossibility of their being already come, she opened a window shutter to be satisfied of the truth. She instantly saw that her ears had not deceived her. The flaring lamps of a carriage were immediately in view. Never in her life had Eleanor found it so difficult to be calm as at that moment. Staying only till she could leave Mrs. Jennings' maid with her sister, she hurried downstairs. The bustle in the vestibule as she passed along an inner lobby assured her that they were already in the house. She rushed forwards towards the drawing-room. She entered it and saw only Willoughby. Eleanor, starting back with a look of horror at the sight of him, turned instantly to quit the room, and her hand was already on the lock when its action was suspended by his saying, in a voice rather of command than supplication, "Miss Dashwood, for half an hour, for 10 minutes, I entreat you to stay." "No, sir," she replied with firmness, "I shall not stay. Your business cannot be with me. My business is with you and only you." "With me?" in the utmost amazement. "Well, sir, be quick, and if you can, less violent. Sit down, and I will be both." She hesitated. She did not know what to do. The possibility of Colonel Brandon arriving and finding him there came across her, but she had promised to hear him, and her curiosity no less than her honour was engaged. "Pray be quick, sir," said Eleanor impatiently. "I have no time to spare." "Your sister," said he with abruptness a moment afterwards, "is out of danger. I heard it from the servant. God be praised, but is it true? Is it really true?" "We hope she is." He rose up and walked across the room. "Mr. Willoughby," Eleanor continued, "you ought to feel, and I certainly do, that after what has passed, your coming here in this manner and forcing yourself upon my notice requires a very particular excuse. What is it that you mean by it?" "I mean," said he, with a serious energy, "I mean to offer some kind of explanation, some kind of apology for the past, to obtain something like forgiveness from your sister." "Is this the real reason for your coming?" "Upon my soul it is," was his answer. "If that is all, you may be satisfied already, for Marianne does. She has long forgiven you." "Then she has forgiven me before she ought to have done it. But she shall forgive me again, and on more reasonable grounds. Now will you listen to me?" Eleanor bowed her assent. My fortune was never large, and I had always been expensive. Every year since my coming of age, or even before, I believe, had added to my debts. And though the death of my old cousin, Mrs. Smith, was to set me free, yet that event being uncertain, and possibly far distant, it had for some time been my intention to re-establish my circumstances by marrying a woman of fortune. To attach myself to your sister, therefore, was not a thing to be thought of. But one thing may be said for me. Even in that horrid state of selfish vanity, I did not know the extent of the injury I meditated, because I did not then know what it was to love. To avoid a comparative poverty, which her affection and her society would have deprived of all its horrors, I have, by raising myself to affluence, lost everything that could make it a blessing. You did then, said Eleanor, a little softened, believe yourself at one time attached to her? Yes, I found myself by insensible degrees sincerely fond of her, and the happiest hours of my life were what I spent with her, when I felt my intentions were strictly honourable, and my feelings blameless. Even then, however, when fully determined on paying my addresses to her, I allowed myself most improperly to put off from day to day the moment of doing it. At last, however, I had determined, as soon as I could engage her alone, to justify the attentions I had so invariably paid her, and openly assure her of an affection which I had already taken such pains to display. But in the interim, before I could have an opportunity of speaking with her in private, a circumstance occurred to ruin all my resolution, and with it all my comfort. A discovery took place. Here he hesitated and looked down. Mrs. Smith had somehow or other been informed of an affair, a connection. But I need not explain myself farther. You have probably heard the whole story long ago. I have, returned Eleanor. And how you will explain away any part of your guilt in that dreadful business, I confess, is beyond my comprehension. Remember, cried Willoughby, from whom you received the account. Could it be an impartial one? I do not mean to defend myself. Her affection for me deserved better treatment. Your indifference, however, towards that unfortunate girl is no apology for your cruel neglect of her. You must have known that while you were enjoying yourself in Devonshire, she was reduced to the extremest indigence. But upon my soul, I did not know it. Well, sir, and what said Mrs. Smith? She taxed me with the offence at once, and my confusion may be guessed. She offered to forgive the past if I would marry Eliza. That could not be, and I was formally dismissed from her favour and her house. The night following this affair was spent by me in deliberating on what my future conduct should be. My affection for Marianne was all insufficient to outweigh that dread of poverty. I had reason to believe myself secure of my present wife if I chose to address her, and I persuaded myself to think that nothing else in common prudence remained for me to do. An heavy scene, however, awaited me before I could leave Devonshire. I was engaged to dine with you that very day. Some apology was therefore necessary for my breaking the engagement, but whether I should write this apology or deliver it in person was a point of long debate. Why did you call, Mr. Willoughby? Said Eleanor reproachfully. A note would have answered every purpose. It was necessary to my own pride. I could not bear to leave the country in a manner that might lead you or the rest of the neighbourhood to suspect any part of what had really passed between myself and Mrs. Smith, and I resolved, therefore, on calling at the cottage in my way to Honiton. The sight of your dear sister, however, was really dreadful. Her sorrow, her deep regret when I told her that I was obliged to leave Devonshire so immediately. I shall never forget it. Oh, God! What an hard-hearted rascal I was! They were both silent for a few moments. Eleanor first spoke. Well, sir, she said, who, though pitying him, grew impatient for his departure. And this is all? All,
No! Have you forgot what passed in town? That infamous letter! Did she show it to you?
Yes, I saw every note that passed.
When the first of hers reached me, my feelings were very, very painful. To know that Marianne was in town was a thunderbolt.
This is not right, Mr. Willoughby. Remember that you are married. Relate only what in your conscience you think necessary for me to hear.
Marianne's note, by assuring me that I was still as dear to her as in the former days, made me know myself better. I felt she was infinitely dearer to me than any other woman in the world, and that I was using her infamously. But everything was then just settled between Miss Grey and me. To retreat was impossible.
All I had to do was to avoid you both. I sent no answer to Marianne, and for some time I was even determined not to call in Berkeley Street. But at last I watched you all safely out of the house one morning, and left my name. Watched us out of the house? Even so. You would be surprised to hear how often I watched you, how often I was on the point of falling in with you. I have entered many a shop to avoid your sight as the carriage drove by. I blundered on Sir John, I believe, the first morning of his coming, and the day after I had called at Mrs. Jennings. He asked me to a party, a dance at his house in the evening. The next morning brought another short note from Marianne, still affectionate, open, artless, confiding. I could not answer it. I tried, but could not frame a sentence. But I thought of her, I believe, every moment of the day. If you can pity me, Miss Dashwood, pity my situation as it was then. With my head and heart so full of your sister, I was forced to play the happy lover to another woman. Well, at last, as I need not tell you, you were forced on me. And what an evening of agony it was. Marianne, beautiful as an angel on one side, calling me Willoughby in such a tone. Oh, God! Holding out her hand to me, asking for an explanation with those bewitching eyes. I ran away from you all as soon as I could. But not before I had seen Marianne's sweet face as white as death. That was the last look I ever had of her. A short pause of mutual thoughtfulness succeeded. Willoughby broke it thus. Well, let me make haste and be gone. Your sister is certainly out of danger. We are assured of it. Your poor mother, too, doting on Marianne. But the letter, Mr. Willoughby, your own letter. Have you anything to say about that? Yes, that in particular. Your sister wrote to me again, you know, the very next morning. Her letter happened to catch Sophia's eye before it caught mine, and its size, the elegance of the paper, the handwriting altogether immediately gave her a suspicion. Some vague report had reached her before of my attachment to some young lady in Devonshire. She opened the letter directly, and was well paid for her impudence. She read what made her wretched. Her wretchedness I could have borne, but her malice... At all events, it must be appeased. And in short, what do you think of my wife's style of letter-writing? Your wife? The letter was in your own handwriting. Yes, but I had only the credit of copying such sentences as I was ashamed to put my name to. But what could I do? We were engaged, everything in preparation, the day almost fixed. But I am talking like a fool. Preparation, day... In honest words, her money was necessary to me, and in a situation like mine, anything was to be done to prevent a rupture. I copied my wife's words and parted with the last relics of Marianne, her 3 notes and the lock of hair. You are very wrong, Mr. Willoughby. Very blamable, said Eleanor, while her voice, in spite of herself, betrayed a compassionate emotion. You ought not to speak in this way, either of Mrs. Willoughby or my sister. Your wife has a claim to your politeness, to your respect at least. "Do not talk to me of my wife," said he with an heavy sigh. "She does not deserve your compassion. She knew I had no regard for her when we were married. And now do you pity me, Miss Dashwood? Or have I said all this to no purpose? Have I explained away any part of my guilt?" "Yes, you have proved your heart less wicked, much less wicked. Will you repeat to your sister, when she has recovered, what I have been telling you? Tell her of my misery and my penitence. Tell her, if you will, that at this moment she is dearer to me than ever. I will tell her all that is necessary to what may comparatively be called your justification. But you have not explained to me the particular reason of your coming now, or how you heard of her illness. Last night, in Drury Lane lobby, I ran against Sir John Middleton, and when he saw who I was, for the first time these 2 months he spoke to me. As bluntly as he could, he told me that Marianne Dashwood was dying of a putrid fever at Cleveland. My resolution was soon made, and at 8 o'clock this morning I was in my carriage. Now you know all." Elinor made no answer. Willoughby started up in preparation for going, and said, "There is no use in staying here. I must be off." "Are you going back to town?" "No, to Combe Magna. I have business there, from thence to town in a day or 2. Goodbye." He held out his hand. She could not refuse to give him hers. He pressed it with affection. "And you do think something better of me than you did?" Elinor assured him that she did. "Well," he replied, "once more goodbye. I shall now go away and live in dread of one event." "What do you mean?" "Your sister's marriage." "You are very wrong. She can never be more lost to you than she is now." Within half an hour of Willoughby's leaving the house, Elinor was again called downstairs by the sound of another carriage. Eager to save her mother from every unnecessary moment's horrible suspense, she ran immediately into the hall, and reached the outward door just in time to receive and support her as she entered it. Mrs. Dashwood, whose terror as they drew near the house had produced almost the conviction of Marianne's being no more, had no voice to inquire after her, no voice even for Elinor. But she, waiting neither for salutation nor inquiry, instantly gave the joyful relief. Supported into the drawing-room between her daughter and her friend, and there shedding tears of joy, though still unable to speak, Mrs. Dashwood embraced Elinor again and again, turning from her at intervals to press Colonel Brandon's hand. Marianne continued to mend every day, and the brilliant cheerfulness of Mrs. Dashwood's looks and spirits proved her to be, as she repeatedly declared herself, one of the happiest women in the world. Marianne was restored to her, and in her recovery she had yet another source of joy unthought of by Elinor. It was thus imparted to her as soon as any opportunity of private conference between them occurred. "At last we are alone. My Elinor, you do not yet know all of my happiness. Colonel Brandon loves Marianne. He has told me so himself." Her daughter, feeling by turns both pleased and pained, surprised and not surprised, was all silent attention. "He opened his whole heart to me yesterday as we travelled. He has loved her, my Elinor, ever since the first moment of seeing her." Marianne's illness, though weakening in its kind, had not been long enough to make her recovery slow, and it proceeded so smoothly as to enable her to remove, within 4 days, into Mrs. Palmer's dressing-room. When there, at her own particular request, Colonel Brandon was invited to visit her. His emotion in entering the room, in seeing her altered looks, and in receiving the pale hand which she immediately held out to him, was such as in Elinor's conjecture must arise from something more than his affection for Marianne. At the end of another day or 2, Marianne growing visibly stronger every 12 hours, Mrs. Dashwood, urged equally by her own and her daughter's wishes, began to talk of removing to Barton. The day of separation and departure arrived, and Marianne, after taking so particular and lengthened a leave of Mrs. Jennings, and bidding Colonel Brandon farewell with the cordiality of a friend, was carefully assisted by him into the carriage. Mrs. Dashwood and Elinor then followed. Mrs. Jennings was summoned to her chaise, and Colonel Brandon immediately afterwards took his solitary way to Delaford. The Dashwoods were 2 days on the road, and Marianne bore her journey on both without essential fatigue. Everything in that most zealous affection, that most solicitous care could do to render her comfortable, was the office of each watchful companion, and each found their reward in her bodily ease and her calmness of spirits. As they approached Barton, she grew silent and thoughtful, and turning away her face from their notice, sat earnestly gazing through the window. She said little, but every sentence aimed at cheerfulness, and though a sigh sometimes escaped her, it never passed away without the atonement of a smile. The next morning produced no abatement in these happy symptoms. "When the weather is settled, and I have recovered my strength," said she, "we will take long walks together every day. I know we shall be happy. I know the summer will pass happily away. I mean never to be later in rising than 6, and from that time till dinner I shall divide every moment between music and reading." Elinor, however, remembered that her promise to Willoughby was yet unfulfilled, and she feared she had that to communicate which might again unsettle the mind of Marianne. Willing therefore to delay the evil hour, she resolved to wait till her sister's health were more secure, before she appointed it. But the resolution was made only to be broken. Marianne had been 2 or 3 days at home before the weather was fine enough for an invalid like herself to venture out. Marianne, leaning on Elinor's arm, was authorized to walk as long as she could without fatigue in the lane before the house. The sisters set out, and they had advanced only so far beyond the house as to admit a full view of the hill, the important hill behind, when, pausing with her eyes turned towards it, Marianne calmly said, "There, on that projecting mound, there I fell, and there I first saw Willoughby." Her voice sunk with the word, but presently reviving, she added, "I am thankful to find that I can look with so little pain on the spot. Shall we ever talk on that subject, Elinor?" Elinor tenderly invited her to be open. "As for regret," said Marianne, "I have done with that as far as he is concerned. At present, if I could be assured that he never was so very wicked as my fears have sometimes fancied him since the story of that unfortunate girl—" She stopped. Elinor joyfully treasured her words as she answered, "If you could be assured of that, you think you should be easy?" "Yes." "How, then," asked her sister, "would you account for his behaviour?" "I would suppose him only fickle, very, very fickle." Elinor said no more. She was debating within herself on the eligibility of beginning her story directly. Marianne pressed her hand and continued, "To say that I shall soon, or that I shall ever, forget Willoughby would be idle. His remembrance can be overcome by no change of circumstances or opinions, but it shall be regulated, it shall be checked by religion, by reason, by constant employment." She paused, and added in a lower voice, "If I could but know his heart, everything would become easy." Elinor, who had now been for some time reflecting on the propriety or impropriety of speedily hazarding her narration, soon found herself leading to the fact. She managed the recital, as she hoped, with address, prepared her anxious listener with caution, related simply and honestly the chief points on which Willoughby grounded his apology. Marianne said not a word. She trembled. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, and her lips became whiter than even sickness had left them. She caught every syllable with panting eagerness. Her hand, unknowingly to herself, closely pressed her sister's, and tears covered her cheeks. Elinor, dreading her being tired, led her towards home, and till they reached the door of the cottage talked of nothing but Willoughby. As soon as they entered the house, Marianne with a kiss of gratitude and these 2 words, just articulate through her tears. "Tell Mamma," withdrew from her sister and walked slowly upstairs. Mrs. Dashwood did not hear unmoved the vindication of her former favourite. She rejoiced in his being cleared from some part of his imputed guilt. She wished him happy. But nothing could remove the guilt of his conduct towards Eliza. Nothing could replace him, therefore, in her former esteem, nor injure the interests of Colonel Brandon. In the evening, when they were all 3 together, Marianne began voluntarily to speak of him again. "I wish to assure you both," she said, "that I see everything, as you can desire me to do. It is a great relief to me, what Eleanor told me this morning. I have now heard exactly what I would wish to hear." For some moments her voice was lost, but recovering herself, she added, and with greater calmness than before, "I am now perfectly satisfied. I wish for no change." Marianne's lips quivered. "Do you really think him selfish?" "The whole of his behaviour," replied Eleanor, "from the beginning to the end of the affair, has been grounded on selfishness. It was selfishness which first made him sport with your affections." "It is very true. My happiness was never his object. At present," continued Eleanor, "he regrets what he has done. And why does he regret it? Because he finds it has not answered towards himself. It has not made him happy." "I have no doubt of it," said Marianne, "and I have nothing to regret. Nothing but my own folly." "Rather say your mother's imprudence, my child," said Mrs. Dashwood. "She must be answerable." Marianne would not let her proceed, and Eleanor, satisfied that each felt their own error, wished to avoid any survey of the past that might weaken her sister's spirits. She therefore, pursuing the first subject, immediately continued, "One observation may, I think, be fairly drawn from the whole of the story, that all Willoughby's difficulties have arisen from the first offence against virtue in his behaviour to Eliza Williams. That crime has been the origin of every lesser one, and of all his present discontents." Eleanor grew impatient for some tidings of Edward. She had heard nothing of him since her leaving London, nothing new of his plans, nothing certain even of his present abode. She was not doomed, however, to be long in ignorance of his measures. Their manservant had been sent one morning to Exeter on business, and when, as he waited at table, he had satisfied the inquiries of his mistress as the event of his errand, this was his voluntary communication. "I suppose you know, ma'am, that Mr. Ferrars is married?" Marianne gave a violent start, fixed her eyes upon Eleanor, saw her turning pale, and fell back in her chair in hysterics. Mrs. Dashwood was shocked to perceive Eleanor's countenance too, and knew not on which child to bestow her principal attention. "Who told you that Mr. Ferrars was married, Thomas?" "I saw Mr. Ferrars myself, ma'am, this morning in Exeter, and his lady too, Miss Steele, as was. They was stopping in a chaise at the door of the New London Inn. I happened to look up as I went by the chaise, and so I see directly it was the youngest Miss Steele." "But did she tell you she was married, Thomas?" "Yes, ma'am." "Was Mr. Ferrars in the carriage with her?" "Yes, ma'am. But he did not look up. He never was much of a gentleman for talking." "Was there no one else in the carriage?" "No, ma'am. Only they two." "Do you know where they came from?" "They came straight from town, as Mrs. Ferrars told me." "And are they going farther westward?" "Yes, ma'am, but not to bide long. They will soon be back again, and then they'd be sure and call here." Mrs. Dashwood now looked at her daughter, but Eleanor knew better than to expect them. She recognised the whole of Lucy in the message, and was very confident that Edward would never come near them. Eleanor now found the difference between the expectation of an unpleasant event, however certain the mind may be told to consider it, and certainty itself. In spite of herself, she had always admitted a hope, while Edward remained single, that something would occur to prevent his marrying Lucy. That he should be married so soon, before he could be in orders, and consequently before he could be in possession of the living, surprised her at first. But she soon saw how likely it was that Lucy, in her haste to secure him, should overlook everything but the risk of delay. Elinor flattered herself that some one of her connections in London would write to them to announce the event and give father particulars. But day after day passed off, and brought no letter, no tidings. Though uncertain that anyone were to blame, she found fault with every absent friend. "When do you write to Colonel Brandon, Mamma?" was an inquiry which sprung from the impatience of her mind to have something going on. "I wrote to him, my love, last week, and rather expect to see than to hear from him again." This was something to look forward to. Colonel Brandon must have some information to give. Scarcely had she so determined it, when the figure of a man on horseback drew her eyes to the window. He stopped at their gate. It was a gentleman. It was Colonel Brandon himself. Now she should hear more, and she trembled at the expectation of it. But it was not Colonel Brandon. Were it possible, she should say it must be Edward. She looked again. He had just dismounted. She could not be mistaken. It was Edward. "He comes purposely to see us. I will be calm. I will be mistress of myself." His footsteps were heard along the gravel path. In a moment he was in the passage, and in another he was before them. His countenance as he entered the room was not too happy even for Elinor. Mrs. Dashwood gave him her hand and wished him joy. He coloured and stammered out an unintelligible reply. A very awful pause took place. It was put an end to by Mrs. Dashwood, who felt obliged to hope that he had left Mrs. Ferrars very well. In a hurried manner he replied in the affirmative. Another pause. Elinor, resolving to exert herself, though fearing the sound of her own voice, now said, "Is Mrs. Ferrars at Longstaple?" "At Longstaple?" he replied with an air of surprise. No. My mother is in town." "I meant," said Elinor, taking up some work from the table, "I meant to inquire after Mrs. Edward Ferrars." She dared not look up, but her mother and Marianne both turned their eyes on him. He coloured, seemed perplexed, looked doubtingly, and after some hesitation said, "Perhaps you mean, my brother. You mean Mrs. Robert Ferrars." "Mrs. Robert Ferrars?" was repeated by Marianne and her mother in an accent of the utmost amazement. Elinor could not speak. Even her eyes were fixed on him with the same impatient wonder. He rose from his seat and walked to the window. "Perhaps you do not know. You may not have heard that my brother is lately married to Miss Lucy Steele." Elinor could sit no longer. She almost ran out of the room, and as soon as the door was closed, burst into tears of joy. His errand at Barton, in fact, was a simple one. It was only to ask Elinor to marry him. How he was received need not be particularly told. This only need be said, that when they all sat down to table at 4 o'clock, about 3 hours after his arrival, he had secured his lady, engaged her mother's consent, and was not only in the rapturous profession of the lover, but in the reality of reason and truth, one of the happiest of men. But Elinor, how are her feelings to be described? From the moment of learning that Lucy was married to another, that Edward was free, to the moment of his justifying the hopes which had so instantly followed, she was everything by turns but tranquil. Edward was now fixed at the cottage for at least a week. For whatever other claims might be made on him, it was impossible that less than a week should be given up to the enjoyment of Elinor's company. Lucy's marriage formed, of course, one of the earliest discussions of the lovers. How they could be thrown together, and by what attraction Robert could be drawn on to marry a girl of whose beauty she had herself heard him speak without any admiration. Edward could only attempt an explanation by supposing that, perhaps at first accidentally meeting, the vanity of the one had been so worked on by the flattery of the other as to lead by degrees to all the rest. How long it had been carrying on between them, however, he was equally at a loss with herself to make out. For at Oxford he had had no means of hearing of her but from herself, and when at last it burst on him in a letter from Lucy, he had been for some time, he believed, half stupefied between the wonder, the horror, and the joy of such a deliverance. However it may have come about, said Eleanor after a pause, they are certainly married, and your mother has brought on herself a most appropriate punishment. She will hardly be less hurt, I suppose, by Robert's marrying Lucy than she would have been by your marrying her. She will be more hurt by it, for Robert was always her favourite. She will be more hurt by it, and on the same principle will forgive him much sooner. Edward heard with pleasure of Colonel Brandon's being expected at the cottage, as he really wished not only to be better acquainted with him, but to have an opportunity of convincing him that he no longer resented his giving the living of Delaford. One question after this only remained undecided between them. One difficulty only was to be overcome. They only wanted something to live upon. Edward had £2,000 and Eleanor £1, which, with Delaford living, was all that they could call their own. They were neither of them quite enough in love to think that £350 a year would supply them with the comforts of life. Edward was not entirely without hopes of some favourable change in his mother towards him, and on that he rested for the residue of their income. About 4 days after Edward's arrival, Colonel Brandon appeared to complete Mrs. Dashwood's satisfaction. No rumour of Lucy's marriage had yet reached him. He knew nothing of what had passed, and the first hours of his visit were consequently spent in hearing and in wondering. And he found fresh reason to rejoice in what he had done for Mr. Ferrers, since eventually it promoted the interest of Eleanor. It would be needless to say that the gentlemen advanced in the good opinion of each other as they advanced in each other's acquaintance, for it could not be otherwise. Their resemblance in good principles and good sense, their being in love with two sisters, and two sisters fond of each other, made that mutual regard inevitable. After a visit on Colonel Brandon's side of only 3 or 4 days, the two gentlemen quitted Barton together. They were to go immediately to Delaford, that Edward might have some personal knowledge of his future home, and assist his patron and friend in deciding on what improvements were needed to it, and from thence to proceed on his journey to town. After a proper resistance on the part of Mrs. Ferrers, Edward was admitted to her presence and pronounced to be again her son. And therefore, after such an ungracious delay as she owned to her own dignity, she issued her decree of consent to the marriage of Edward and Eleanor. What she would engage to do towards augmenting their income was next to be considered, and here nothing was promised, either for the present or in future, beyond the £10,000 which had been given with Fanny. It was as much, however, as was desired, and more than was expected by Edward and Eleanor. With an income quite sufficient to their wants thus secured to them, they had nothing to wait for after Edward was in possession of the living, but the readiness of the house, to which Colonel Brandon was making considerable improvements. Eleanor, as usual, broke through the first positive resolution of not marrying till everything was ready, and the ceremony took place in Barton Church early in the autumn. They had, in fact, nothing to wish for but the marriage of Colonel Brandon and Marianne, and rather better pasturage for their cows. Mrs. Dashwood's wish of bringing Marianne and Colonel Brandon together was hardly less earnest. It was now her darling object. With such a confederacy against her, with a knowledge so intimate of his goodness, with a conviction of his fond attachment to herself, what could Marianne do? And so it was. Instead of falling a sacrifice to an irresistible passion, as once she had fondly flattered herself with expecting, instead of remaining even for ever with her mother, and finding her only pleasures in retirement and study, she found herself at 19 submitting to new attachments, entering on new duties, placed in a new home, a wife, the mistress of a family, and the patroness of a village. Colonel Brandon was now as happy as all those who best loved him believed he deserved to be. In Marianne he was consoled for every past affliction. Her regard and her society restored his mind to animation and his spirits to cheerfulness, and that Marianne found her own happiness in forming his was equally the persuasion and delight of each observing friend. Marianne could never love by halves, and her whole heart became in time as much devoted to her husband as it had once been to Willoughby. Willoughby could not hear of her marriage without a pang. That his repentance of misconduct, which thus brought its own punishment, was sincere, need not be doubted. But he lived to exert, and frequently to enjoy himself. His wife was not always out of humour, nor his home always uncomfortable. And in his breed of horses and dogs, and in sporting of every kind, he found no inconsiderable degree of domestic felicity. Mrs. Dashwood was prudent enough to remain at the cottage without attempting a removal to Delaford, and fortunately for Sir John and Mrs. Jennings, when Marianne was taken from them, Margaret had reached an age highly suitable for dancing, and not very ineligible for being supposed to have a lover. Between Barton and Delaford there was that constant communication which strong family affection would naturally dictate, and among the merits and the happiness of Elinor and Marianne, let it not be ranked as the least considerable that though sisters, and living almost within sight of each other, they could live without disagreement between themselves, or producing coolness between their husbands.